The year was 166 CE. Marcus Aurelius had been emperor of Rome for 5 years, and nothing in his life had prepared him for what was coming. He had been trained as a philosopher, not a warrior. He had studied Stoicism under Epictetus's disciple Rusticus, had read every Greek text he could find, and had spent his days writing private meditations to himself, notes to keep his mind disciplined, his character honest, his ambitions in check. He was, by every account, the most thoughtful ruler Rome had ever had. And then the Marcomannic tribes crossed the Danube, slaughtered 2 Roman legions, and began marching south. The empire had not seen an invasion of this magnitude in 2 centuries, and the philosopher emperor who sat on the throne had to decide, read about war or go fight one. Marcus had studied the Stoics closely enough to know that fear was not the problem. The problem was the story you told yourself about the threat. Epictetus, a former slave who had become the most influential philosopher of his age, taught that we suffer not from events, but from our judgments about events. Marcus had written this idea back to himself in his private notebooks hundreds of times. Now he was about to test it against something real. The legions were already mobilizing. His generals were waiting for orders. His wife Faustina had borne him 13 children, 9 of whom had already died. He had learned to hold loss without being destroyed by it. He folded his notebooks, set down his pen, and went to meet his generals. He had barely reached the northern frontier when the second disaster arrived. A plague, carried back by returning soldiers from the eastern campaigns, had begun spreading through Rome. The Antonine Plague, historians would later call it. It killed an estimated 5 million people over the following decade. It moved through military camps with terrible efficiency. Marcus watched his army shrink not from battle but from disease, watched soldiers he had trained die of fever before they ever reached the enemy. He wrote in his meditations, during those months, one of the lines that would define his philosophy: confine yourself to the present, not to the plague that was spreading, not to the battles that hadn't been fought yet, only to what was directly in front of him. This hour, this problem, this man. The Stoic framework that Marcus lived by had a central idea he called the dichotomy of control, the absolute division between what is up to us and what is not. What is up to us? Our judgments, our intentions, our responses to what happens. What is not up to us? The weather on the day of battle, the strength of the enemy, the loyalty of allies, the health of the men, the outcome of the fight. A general who confuses these 2 categories, who tries to control the weather by worrying about it or breaks his own discipline trying to manipulate outcomes he cannot reach, the general loses twice. He loses to the enemy and he loses to himself. Marcus spent years writing this distinction down, because it did not come naturally. Nothing that hard ever does. The winter of 170 CE on the Danube frontier was among the most brutal in Roman memory. Marcus commanded from the field, not from a comfortable palace. He ate with the soldiers, slept in military tents, endured the same frost and mud as the legionaries who served under him. His letters to the Senate during this period are precise, detailed, unsentimental. He does not complain. He does not catastrophize. He reports conditions, makes requests, and returns to work. In his private notebooks, however, he wrote with more honesty, "Do not indulge in the thought that things will always be as they are now." He knew the campaigns might last years. He knew he might die on this frontier. What he did not allow himself to do was spend energy grieving the fact of it. In 175 CE, while Marcus was still fighting in the north, a general named Avidius Cassius, one of his most trusted commanders, declared himself emperor. A false rumor had spread that Marcus was dead, and Cassius had seized the opportunity. When Marcus heard the news, his immediate reaction was not rage. It was recorded by those present as a kind of quiet sadness. He wrote to the Senate asking them not to execute Cassius if he was captured. He wrote to his own troops reminding them that civil war was the worst possible outcome for everyone involved. Cassius was killed before the confrontation could happen, killed by his own officers, who understood what was coming. Marcus reportedly expressed genuine regret that he had been denied the chance to pardon him. The Stoics believed in what they called amor fati, the love of fate, not passive acceptance, not resignation. Something stranger and more demanding, the active embrace of what happens. Marcus Aurelius had lost 9 children before they reached adulthood. He had watched a plague consume his empire. He had been betrayed by a general he trusted. He had spent the last decade of his life, the years when a Roman emperor might reasonably expect peace and reflection, living in military camps along the Danube. And he did not merely endure these things. He found a way to see them as necessary, not pleasant, not desirable, but woven into the fabric of what had to be. Love the discipline you know, he wrote, and let it support you. What made Marcus Aurelius remarkable was not that he suppressed his feelings. The Stoics were frequently misunderstood on this point. They did not teach the elimination of emotion, but the refinement of it, the distinction between impressions that merely feel true and judgments that actually are true. When Marcus received the news of his son Commodus's failures of character, the cruelty, the vanity, the recklessness that would eventually define Commodus's reign, he did not pretend not to feel it. He felt it deeply. He wrote about the pain of raising a child who becomes something you did not intend. What he refused to do was let that grief become something that made him unable to act. The discipline of emotion, not its extinction. The meditations of Marcus Aurelius were never meant to be read by anyone else. They were private notes, written in Greek, not Latin, which suggests he was writing for himself alone rather than for any audience. He called the book to himself. It is a record not of a man who had mastered Stoicism, but of a man who was struggling to practice it. He wrote the same lessons back to himself again and again, because he needed to hear them again and again. This is perhaps what makes the text so enduring. It is not the self-congratulation of someone who has it figured out. It is the daily discipline of someone who is not sure he does, and keeps practicing anyway. By the time Marcus Aurelius returned north for his final campaign in 178 CE, he was 57 years old. His health had been declining for years. The campaigns on the Danube had taken something from him that peace would not have. And yet he went. His generals had urged him to remain in Rome, to administer from a distance. He understood that a frontier campaign required a commander present, that the symbolic weight of the emperor's presence on the front had effects that could not be replicated by orders sent from a palace. He also understood, perhaps, that dying in Rome would have meant something different to him than dying where his work was. He brought his notebooks with him, as always. Marcus Aurelius died in March of 180 CE, near the city that is now Vienna, during his second Danube campaign. He was 58 years old. His last recorded words, reported by the Historia Augusta, were addressed to the officer standing guard over his tent. Go to the rising sun. I am already setting. He had written years earlier that a man's death was only a small part of the whole, that the universe did not owe him a long life or a comfortable one, that what mattered was not the length of life but its quality, not the number of days but what you did with each of them. He had spent his last decade living this belief in a military camp, in the cold north, writing to himself every morning before the day began. The discipline that Marcus Aurelius practiced was not dramatic. It did not look like strength from the outside. It looked like a tired man, writing by lamplight, reminding himself again of things he already knew but kept forgetting under pressure. It looked like a general who had lost 9 children choosing not to be defined by what he had lost. It looked like a philosopher who became a warrior not because war was glorious, but because duty required it, and he had decided long ago that virtue meant doing what was required regardless of how it felt. The Stoic warrior is not the one who feels nothing. He is the one who feels everything and acts rightly anyway. Marcus Aurelius was proof that this was possible, and proof that it was hard, and proof that it was worth doing every single day.